Hi, class. Today we are moving into the Nixon administration. Now, we've touched on the Nixon administration a little bit in previous lessons, but today we're going to get into some more detail on the Nixon administration. So, starting with Nixon, we need to start where his presidential career begins, and that is with the election of 1968. Now, obviously, he's not going to be inaugurated until January of 1969, but he can at least, he's elected president in 1968, and he begins planning his administrative goals and other things like that, or at least realizing the plan for that. He obviously had campaign platforms and promises, one of which was getting America out of the Vietnam War, the idea of peace with honor. So, in the election of 1968, Richard Nixon is going to win that election. He wins, I think it's 301 electoral votes. However, the popular vote is a much slimmer margin than that. So I think he wins with about 1% of the popular vote. And then once Nixon gets into the White House, he's going to have some domestic plans, like plans at home for the United States, the contiguous United States. And then he's going to have some foreign or diplomatic policies, so foreign policy, domestic policy. And as far as at home, domestically, one of the things that Richard Nixon is going to be working toward is ending Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. So Lyndon Johnson establishes Great Society programs, which were a lot of social programs. It was like a giant grouping of social programs where the government is going to be intervening in personal lives, offering more things like welfare, education funding, and the like. Richard Nixon is going to ease back some of what Lyndon Johnson had included in the Great Society. Now, that's not to say that Richard Nixon isn't going to do some social programs. Nixon is going to alter and somewhat augment federal welfare programs. So he's going to grow them a little bit, but he's also going to get rid of a lot of what LBJ had done as far as social programs. So domestically, Nixon's working on a couple of things. One is easing back the amount of social programs that we have as a nation, and also he's wanting to impact the judicial branch of the government through his appointments to the Supreme Court and to other federal courts. So those are two things that Nixon is working on domestically. We can talk about some of his other domestic initiatives or at least goals, but those are the two big things that he was working on. And then foreign policy wise, one thing that Nixon is really pushing for, it's like his main focus, aside from Vietnam. Obviously Vietnam is a big focus, but he's looking bigger picture than just Vietnam because we're still in the middle of a Cold War. And Nixon is wanting to change the way America is involved in the Cold War. And Nixon feels like we have a very short-sighted view of what we should be doing in the Cold War as a nation because we're in a bipolar world where we have the U.S. as one world power and the USSR, Russia, and its satellite nations as the other world power. And so he sees this as a major cause of conflict because whenever you have two major powers with different philosophies, they're going to clash. And so his goal was something called multipolarity, and this would be Nixon's foreign policy. And so what he wants to do is to bring other world powers up. So maybe nations that aren't quite to the level of being a world power to help them develop into a world power so that instead of just having two world powers, we have three or more world powers, and that hopefully that will balance out this conflict because if there are multiple players in the world or the global sphere, then there won't just be a clash between two nations. Maybe there'll be more balance. Now, it's a risk, especially because his plan involves bringing another communist nation, China, up to the level of a world power, or at least including them more in global affairs. So his goal for multipolarity is reaching out to China, and he's going to be the first president to visit China since it fell to communism. And his goal is to establish better trade relations and better diplomatic relations with China so that we can then help them become more involved in global affairs, and then hopefully that'll take some of the heat off of us from Russia. Now, this could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. It's a very risky move because China's communist, Russia, the USSR, is communist, and America is a capitalist nation. And so we would have then two communist major world powers and one dominant capitalist world power. Now, one could argue that the UK would be another world power, but really after World War II, the UK's global influence just decreases dramatically. So they're not really involved in this at this point. I mean, they're there, but they're not on the same power scale militarily or economically as the United States. So, looking at this, one goal, multipolarity. The other goal that Nixon has is talking with, establishing an open line of communication with the USSR, and hopefully finding a way to solve this nuclear stalemate. So Nixon gets involved in SALT talks, which is a strategic arms limitation talk, where hopefully the goal is to establish a treaty or some kind of agreement where we will, as both nations, agree to limit our nuclear capabilities. Now, the first round of SALT talks is SALT 1. And SALT 1 occurs in 1972. And at these SALT talks, the USSR and the US agree to limit their ICBMs, those are intercontinental ballistic missiles. So these would be delivery systems for nuclear bombs. And both nations agree to keep their ICBM arsenal at current levels. So freeze them at the levels they're at and don't add any more to them. So, however, an agreement is only as good as the people keeping the agreement, right? So just because we agree to this and follow the agreement, if we do follow it, right, it doesn't mean the USSR is going to actually follow the agreement, right? And the USSR is saying the same thing. Just because the US agrees to it doesn't mean they're actually going to follow through with it. So it's symbolic, but that doesn't mean that it's actual tangible progress. It's definitely progress as far as the US and the USSR sitting down and reaching an agreement. The follow-through is the real big question. But anyway, this is a big win for Nixon because we sit down and we actually make an agreement, right? If you remember back before the U-2 incident, Eisenhower was trying to do something similar, have open lines of communication with the USSR and ease back on some of the Cold War rhetoric. However, the U-2 incident under Eisenhower really just wrecked all of that progress. So now we're seeing under Nixon, we're actually making some symbolic progress with the USSR, and maybe with China being involved with multipolarity, that might also be something helpful as well. So you can draw your own conclusions whether you think it was a good decision or not, because you can look at where we're at in history and look at our positions with China right now, militarily, economically, and the like, and see what you think the current result of multipolarity is. All right, now we're going to pause there for a second, store that in our memory banks, and then I'm going to talk about Watergate. So whenever anyone says Richard Nixon, generally people think Watergate, because biblically in the book of Ecclesiastes, it teaches us that a bad decision can outweigh good decisions as far as the way people view us. So it's, if you ever heard of fly in the ointment, like someone talk about, oh, a fly in the ointment, that comes from Ecclesiastes, where just as one poor major decision can affect the way people perceive us. Now, that's not to say God will and can forgive us for that, right? That doesn't affect our eternal standing with God, but it can affect the way people view us, right? So even if you look at anyone, like if you were a big LeBron fan, right? LeBron hasn't always been with the same team, and some people were unhappy with that decision, right? Or if you ever had a favorite team that traded a major player, that can affect the way you view the team, or it can affect the way you view the player, right? Similarly, with Watergate, Nixon did good things and made some good appointments to the Supreme Court. He had some decent domestic policy. He had some decent foreign policy. But Watergate just wrecks all of that. Same with like Bill Clinton. Whenever someone says Bill Clinton, the first thing people usually think, aside, they might think Hillary, and then they think impeachment. They don't look at his record as a whole. They think he was impeached, right? So if you look at Richard Nixon, Watergate is what people tend to think, and Watergate was just it was the end of his career, and it really affected Nixon's reputation in a very, very negative way. So here's what happens. In June of 1972, and 72 is an election year, and the election occurs in November, right? So in June of 1972, the Watergate building is broken into, particularly a particular room in the Watergate building. So the DNC, or the Democratic National Committee headquarters, is in this Watergate building, and the Democratic National Committee headquarters is broken into, and 5 people are arrested, and one of those people just happened to work for the CIA in the past. Well, this brings up a whole lot of questions, and eventually it comes out that the committee to re-elect the president, that's an actual committee, paid for this break-in, and that this break-in is tied to the re-election of the president. Now, did Richard Nixon himself order this? There's no evidence of that. But one thing that Richard Nixon did do was participate in cover-up efforts of this. Like, Nixon tried to cover up other people's involvement in Watergate and tried to cover up his own involvement in the cover-up of Watergate, among other things. And one thing that Nixon did is Richard Nixon recorded all of his conversations. So Nixon didn't necessarily trust people around him and wasn't and was trying to protect himself, but this ended up being his undoing. And just kind of like Trump, if you look at the impeachment hearings of Trump there had a transcript of his call to Ukraine, to the Ukrainian president. There's a transcript of that call, right? There's a reason this call is recorded, in case something ever comes up, right? So Trump said, I've got a transcript, and you're going to have a hard time from the transcript directly proving anything untoward occurred. Now, Nixon recorded his conversations, and the tapes were demanded. And aside from the fact that there are 9 minutes missing from the tapes when he actually turns them over, Nixon fights really, really, really hard to not turn over these tapes. So he claims executive privilege, and that's that certain conversations are protected from being subpoenaed because they might contain sensitive information as far as national security is concerned. And that's shot down by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's like, nope, you need to turn the tapes over. Well, when the tapes are turned over, there are missing minutes. And generally, Nixon's complicity in the cover-up is pretty apparent. So formal charges are brought against Nixon. So Nixon is charged with crimes. And Nixon does something in response to this that no other president has ever done in American history. He resigns. So Nixon, on August 9th of 1974, Richard Nixon steps down as president. Now, he's still being charged criminally. He does this for one major reason, is he would have been impeached, and he would have been the only president in American history who was removed from office. Because if you remember our impeachment talks, being impeached is just being formally charged with a crime by the House. The House of Representatives votes to charge you with a crime. Then you have a trial in which the Senate is your jury if you're president, and they either exonerate you or they convict you and remove you from office. Well, Nixon resigns, but he still has criminal charges pending against him. And so his vice president, Ford, which by the way was an appointed vice president, Ford pardons Nixon almost a month later and says America just needs to move on. Now, this looks really shady. I'm not saying Ford did anything wrong, but it seems very shady that Ford would pardon Nixon, particularly since Ford was an appointed vice president. Nixon's VP had stepped down, and Nixon appoints a new VP, and then this new VP just happens to pardon him when he's criminally charged. It just looks really bad. And the American public, their level of trust for elected officials drops even more than it had dropped in the past. So people just start to think politicians are all corrupt. And it's really going to look bad for the Republicans in general in the next election. I mean, that's one of the main reasons why Jimmy Carter gets elected in the election of 76 is because he's not a Republican. And people feel like, well, we can't trust the Republicans, so let's try the other party. And then this is what America does, right? And then you're going to see they're going to be like, well, we don't like that party, let's try the other party. Well, we don't like this party, let's try the other party. But there are only two parties to try, so we just end up going back, forth, back, forth, back, forth. So Richard Nixon is pardoned. America doesn't trust their politicians anymore, particularly the Republican Party. And that's going to lead eventually to Jimmy Carter being elected in 76. What I want you to get for today, I know that's a lot to digest, but what I want you to get for today, Richard Nixon, as far as president, we already talked about his Vietnam policy in past lessons. But as far as domestic policy, he ends LBJ's Great Society programs. Foreign policy, multipolarity with China, and arms limitation talks with the USSR. The big thing with Nixon as far as the blight on his career, Watergate, where he is found to be actively participating in cover-up of what happened in Watergate, and he is criminally charged, steps down as president, which no one else had ever done, and then is pardoned by Ford. All right, that is it for today. I appreciate all the hard work you all have been doing. You guys are doing a great job. Keep it up, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Otherwise, have a great day.